All right, we are back. Again, I am Cashin Yu with the Community Action Partnership, and I am the host for today's event. If you do have any technical difficulties, please find me in the chat window to your right, or you can email me at cyiu@communityactionpartnership.com. I'll put that up in the chat box so you can look at it in a moment. We will have some polls today, so we do appreciate your participation in those. They will pop up periodically throughout. You can put questions into the Q&A box also on that right-hand panel at any time. We will take them at a couple of different points in the webinar, but please feel free to put them in at any point as soon as they come to you. With that, I think we'll wrap up the technical information and hand over to Denise Harlow to do some introductions for today.
Thanks, Cash, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar, Leadership Succession Planning. Today's webinar is made possible in part by the Office of Community Services and the Community Services Block Grant TNTA resources that fund our National Training Center. So thank you to OCS for making today's webinar possible, as well as the accompanying toolkit that you'll be able to find up on our website and that our presenters will be talking about here today. Today's webinar is co-facilitated by Lisa Burford and Don Teddy from Transition Guides. They are out here on the East Coast, but they do provide services across the country and have been long engaged in succession planning work. Don actually is a former Deputy Director of the Illinois Community Action Association, and Lisa has also worked with community action agencies, both very familiar with the issues impacting transition as we're going to be experiencing in community action, in the nonprofit sector, and just in the business world as a whole, as we see retiring baby boomers. And we know we have a lot of slots we need to fill, and how do we do that strategically? As I mentioned, you'll be able to find toolkits up either in the National Training Center's Community Services Block Grant TNTA Resource Center, or on the Partnerships homepage. We have access to the toolkits in both places. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cashin here for any IT backup. Do we have any other IT instructions, Cashin?
I do not believe so, except to remind everybody to do reach out if you have any audio issues to us and to put in your questions whenever they come to you.
Great, thank you, Cash. And then with that, Don, we're going to turn it over to you, and I believe you'll have the ball in your court to control your PowerPoint. So with that, I turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who's joined us today. Delighted to have the opportunity to talk with you a little bit about succession planning and particularly leadership succession planning. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, some background information, then I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, my colleague Lisa Burford, for the content discussion. And again, as Cashin said, anytime you want to pop a question over there in the Q&A box, please feel free to do that. We'll take those throughout the discussion and try to address those. A little bit of background about Transition Guides. It's a company that's based in Silver Spring, Maryland, but we have associates throughout the country, here in the DC area, and North Carolina, New York City area, California, Colorado, and Washington State. One of our specialties is working with founders and long-term executives. I know that probably many of you on the call certainly would fit into that category. We'll take a little bit of a poll here about that in a moment. We work with a wide variety of mission areas, and I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to work with the Community Action Partnership to develop the toolkit that we're going to be talking about in today's discussion. Cashin, how about if I turn it over to you to do the poll, the first poll?
Sure, we have the results. We started it as you were doing your introduction, so I will get those displayed for you in just a moment.
All right, very good, very good. So in terms of the series, we did a series, or doing a series of webinars on the toolkit. There are 3 parts to the toolkit. We talked on late September about organizational sustainability and how to build a more sustainable organization, taking a look at your business model, your business strategy is one area. Another area, taking a look at leadership, both board and executive leadership. Taking a look at a third area of resources, resources broadly, both the financial resources of the organization, but more importantly, the underlying strengths that really underpin your organization and its business model. And then fourth and finally, all that against the backdrop of culture. And so there is a guide or a toolkit that's actually focused on that particular area. Obviously, today we're going to be talking about leadership succession planning, and then following that up on Wednesday with executive transition management. So those are the one of the upcoming webinars that we still have in the series. So today's agenda, we're really going to look at the whole idea of leadership succession planning. We'll take a look at a definition of succession planning and the different types, including 3 approaches to succession planning. And then we're going to drill down on what we call succession essentials. That's really what the toolkit is primarily focused on. There's different types of approaches to succession planning, but one of the things that you can do on a very fundamental to strengthen your organization and ensure its sustainability is put in place what we call succession essentials, which consists of an emergency backup plan, particularly for the chief executive, but ideally for across your leadership positions, and then a board-adopted succession policy, which really helps the board understand the value and role of succession planning, but also helps them get prepared for a chief executive transition whenever that might occur in the future. And then we'll have some, obviously, some discussion about the different elements of succession planning. Okay, Lisa, how about if I turn it over to you to jump into the content?
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Burford, and as was mentioned, I am a consultant with Transition Guides, and I have done a number of succession planning projects for Transition Guides and work with Don on preparing the guides that you will have on these 3 topics that Don just mentioned. So on this page here, you see using the Executive Succession Planning Guide. The idea was that part of our organizational sustainability toolkit will include these 3 guides. As Don mentioned, they're interrelated, and we're specifically talking today about leadership succession, and there will be 2 sections. So the introduction to succession planning, and then there's another section on the 9-step process for succession planning. I will give you an overview of that in today's conversation. The planning guide will include emergency backup succession plan template, which is we found to be a very helpful use for people that take a look at this. It helps to outline some of the steps that you need to take. And then the other key component of this tool is the CEO succession policy template. And again, it's a tool that you can customize, and it is designed to look at the board's policy around this succession work. When we talk about succession planning, let me just go over a few definitions that we use. So succession planning is a systematic process for ensuring leadership availability, continuity, and appropriate development of an organization's leadership talent. So we're really talking about the process that you will use to find and then place your leadership. We specifically talk about 3 types of succession planning, and so I would like to go into those 3 types. First of all, leadership development planning, which is also called talent management. This leader development planning is this process, as I mentioned, of systematically assessing, acquiring, developing, and aligning the organization's talent in a way that builds the organization's capacity and provides a critical link excuse me, between the organizational goals and performance. So it's the strategic HR. In this process, as we look at the organization's talent, it's based on where the organization is growing and what needs to happen at the organization in terms of the goals and performance for the organization. So the talent management is based on the leader. When we talk about departure-defined succession planning, this is a proactive combination of organizational sustainability planning and capacity building to ensure organizational and executive readiness for an executive transition. So typically when we talk about departure-defined, we're talking about a CEO that is leaving within 18 months to 5 years away. And so we have the opportunity to be proactive to looking at how the organizations function in terms of their process, policies, and procedures, as well as building the capacity of the organization so that the organization can remain long after the departure of that executive. And then the third type is what we call succession essentials. And that's really looking at two key pieces, which are the bottom line of what you need when you begin doing this succession work. And that is the executive backup plan and a board-adopted succession policy. And I'll go over those in detail later on in this presentation. But these are the tools and processes to ensure that leadership continuity for all positions in the event of unexpected absences, as well as planned transitions. As was mentioned earlier, if you have any questions about any of the things that I'm saying, please put it up in the chat and I will be sure to respond. So we're having this conversation about succession planning, and the one question is, why would you plan for succession? What's so important about this? What's the issue? So the one question that I have for those of you on the webinar is, how many of you have succession plans? We're going to launch a poll now to find that out. I'd like to find out from you how many of you have a succession plan for the chief executive. But the reasons why we do it, it gets us beyond the ugly truth that we want to avoid. Careers end in transition, eventually. It is a matter of when, how, and how well the transition is managed. But we know it's going to happen, so planning for succession gets us beyond that avoidance. It also helps to ensure organizational sustainability. As CEOs, you want the organization to remain long after you leave, and you certainly wouldn't want your departure to cause the organization to collapse. Succession planning allows you to ensure that the organization will remain a sustainable entity. It also helps to mitigate risk. There are a number of risks that could occur during a transition. Going through this thoughtful process allows you to mitigate that risk. And then lastly, it increases the successfully managed transition, increases the capacity and resiliency of the organization, and allows for the new executive to come in to an organization that has been properly primed for their arrival. Cashin, do we have results of that survey yet?
We do. I just that second displayed them.
All right.
So it looks like about a quarter of you have that succession plan, and about half, a little less than half, don't have it, and then we have some don't knows and didn't answer. One of the things, Lisa, forgive me for barging in here with it.
Please.
But one of the things that, and the reason why we focused on what we call succession essentials is in putting together the toolkit, was that we recognize that these succession conversations are hard. We've been doing this work for about 20 years. We do a program called Next Steps, a 2-day program for chief executives who are thinking about leaving, and we have about 500 alumni from that program, and we stay in periodic touch with them. And what we hear from executives is having that succession conversation is hard. You oftentimes don't want to bring it up because you're fearing that the board may read it the wrong way, that you're tired or you want to leave or that you're dissatisfied or something like that. And the board doesn't want to bring it up oftentimes because they don't want to send the wrong signal to you. And that's the reason why we focused on succession essentials. It's a safe way of really strengthening the organization, of opening up the dialogue about succession in a very safe way, because it's purely a management tool. It's just good management to have that, emergency backup plan. If you won the lottery tonight and ran off to Tahiti with the love of your life, on a moment's notice, what would the organization do? How would they, cover your position? How would the board, what would be the board's game plan for managing that? What would they do to get ready? How would they manage the communications? That's all covered in those two documents that are part and parcel of the toolkit. And so it's again, it's a safe way of opening up this dialogue, this conversation about succession without having to ask and answer those awkward questions about, well, when you think about leaving, and of course you're going to get those questions anyway, and you want to have a good answer for it. But again, this is a safe way of introducing the succession planning topic and really strengthening your organization. You'll get. Lisa talked about the departure-defined succession planning and leader development. But actually, if you really take on succession essentials, you get about 80% of the value that you really need to have in place to have a good succession plan. Back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Don. So let's go a little deeper on each type. I see that from your poll results, the majority of you do not have a plan, a succession plan for your CEO. So let's talk about leader development specifically. So this is the strategic component of talent management. So we're talking about having the right people with the right skills and abilities in the leadership role. And so in order to do that, it takes some strategy and planning to get there. It includes assessing the individuals that are in the position, making sure that they're aligned with the responsibilities of that position, and it takes an ongoing investment to make this happen. It is an opportunity to align your team with community diversity to make sure you have the right people in serving the population that you serve. The benefit of this is certainly to broaden the organization's ability to do its work, but also to sustain the leadership capacity that it needs. It builds the bench strength for your organization. When we talk about departure-defined succession planning, there are two tracks in looking at this work. One is the executive preparation, and the second is the organization's preparation. So we're looking at how do we deal with the executive's departure as an individual personally, and then at the organizational level, how do we ensure that the organization is ready for this succession planning? And the goal of this work is to increase the organization's capacity to deliver its mission under new leadership whenever the transition occurs. So we're doing this planning so that we can be ready for the new person whenever. And some of the outcomes of departure-defined succession planning is the capacity building to strengthen the 4 critical elements of organizational sustainability. When we look at organizational sustainability, we are looking at these critical elements, which include the strategy, which is how you do business. It's your business model. We also look at the resources, both financial and human resources. We look at the leadership. Who is the leader of your organization, both on staff and the board? And then we look at the culture of your organization. And so as we look at this departure-defined succession planning, we're asking those questions around the capacity building of your organization to remain viable. The succession policy that I mentioned outlines the board's policies and roles for the chief executive transition. So you have this documented for your next leader. And then another outcome is the backup plans, which include cross-training to ensure continuity. So we're doing backup plans for key leadership, and then we're looking at who else knows of those responsibilities. So those are the key outcomes from departure-defined succession planning. I mentioned succession essentials, And when we talk about the essentials, we're saying these are some of the basic tools that you will need when you begin this succession work. It is sort of your first step to getting it done, to having the conversation and making sure that you are prepared. So the first thing is the board-adopted succession policy. And then we have the executive backup plans that I mentioned, and that would be for the chief executive and for the senior leadership positions. And the goal of this work is to ensure continuity. I'm sure a number of you in your organizations, when you talk about backup plans, you think about, well, I know what I do, but the question is, who else knows what you do? So having these backup plans allows you to examine your current role, who can back you up, who should back you up, and then what training do they need in order to successfully back you up. When we talk about the backup plan is an agreement between the individual and his or her designated backups. And so the idea is, I'm going to create a backup plan, but I also need to let John or Timothy or Susie know that they're backing me up, and I need to ensure that they know what the key function is that they're backing up. We also look at, in this backup plan, identifying key duties and key responsibilities. What is it that I am currently doing? What are my responsibilities and relationships that allow me to do these key duties? And then the cross-training plan, that's a very key component of the backup plan. The cross-training plan allows people to say, I don't know what your current job is, but you're asking me to back you up, so I'm going to need training. If I'm going to be responsible for going out doing presentations, I need some PowerPoint training, as you know, just an example. Or if I'm going to be responsible for the financials, I'm going to need some QuickBook training. Or I need to know who those key relationships are if I'm now suddenly responsible for you know, maintaining our company communications. So it's an opportunity to say, here are my key duties and key relationships, and here's how I can get you ready to back me up when necessary. And again, the idea of doing this backup plan is to prepare you for the case when the key leader is no longer available. And whether that's an emergency, whether that's a 1 hour, backup, or whether it's a 1 week or 1 month backup, it's a good idea to have the backup plan so that all parties involved can be covered. When we talk about the succession policy, again, it is a board-adopted policy that there's a sample in the toolkit that you'll see in terms of some of the key components. But it outlines a process to handle a planned departure. It sets out the important commitments that need to be made. First of all, preparing for the inevitable leadership change, and then assessing the leadership needs before beginning a search. How will the board do that? What is their process? So it gives them the opportunity to think about it when you're not in an emergency situation, so that all of this will be documented and ready to begin the search when you need to. The next point about the succession policy is it gives you an opportunity to, for the board to discuss their plan to appoint interim leadership, if necessary, whether that is internal or whether you're going to hire an interim executive director. But looking at what is the policy around that and how will we do that to ensure continuity and stability of the organization. And then the last thing about the succession policy is it clarifies who's authorized to implement the plan. And it's very important that everyone involved knows when it's time to begin the work of the succession policy, who's in charge. The benefits of succession planning, and I've mentioned this throughout my conversation, but when you look at a succession planning project, it does take time from the organization, takes time from the leaders of the organization to do this work, but there are certainly benefits to the organization long term. First of all, it ensures continuity. The idea of you don't want someone to come in and have to start from ground zero. So it ensures that continuity from the first leader to the next. When we talk about the backup plans, you have a roadmap of what this person did, how they did it, their key responsibilities, and who can back them up. So it allows you to not have to start from ground zero. The second important benefit of succession planning is it builds the bench depth and internal capacity. It allows the existing staff to dig deeper into their roles and to get clear on for the organization, the capacity of the staffing. It also allows the current staff to step up in a way if that is their goal in terms of working with the organization long term. A third point of the benefits of succession planning is it minimizes the crisis of unplanned absence. Now, certainly an unplanned absence is just that, unplanned. But the idea of it being a crisis, it minimizes that crisis piece because at least you know what the person did, you can back up their key functions, and the whole organization isn't out of sorts because that person isn't there. So this unplanned absence becomes less of an emergency because you have this succession plan in place. And then the last piece is the succession planning identifies organizational gaps in coverage. And that is, it allows you to say when you begin talking about your backup plans or your cross-training, you get to see what's missing and what assistance is needed in various departments by various people, and then you can identify and help build the strength of the organization through this process. Before I get into the 9 steps of succession essentials, Don, did you have anything you wanted to add to that part of the conversation?
No, but I think you covered it, and I mentioned earlier that just the reason why we focused on succession essentials is it gets the conversation going in a very, safe way. No one can argue that, having an emergency backup plan is a bad idea. No one can argue that, having the board having a good succession policy in place and really thinking through how they would handle an emergency absence or a permanent absence, that's a bad idea. So again, it's a safe way of introducing it.
Great, thank you. Now, I mentioned the 9 steps to succession essentials, and the idea of understanding the people that are on this call, as I understand it, the majority of you do not have a succession plan in place, so this is a good place to focus our time on in this call about how to get it started. So first of all, we suggest that you organize a small task force. And this task force is made up of people who know the organization, who have the time to give input to this conversation, and have some experience, knowledge, or desire to look at the future of your organization. The second step is to orient. Yes.
Could I jump in on that? On the
Please.
task force, oftentimes, first of all, we encourage the CEO to be the point person of that task force because this backup planning and the succession policy really, it's about the interface between the board and the executive position. And so our feeling is that the chief executive ought to be involved in it, if not chairing that task force. Then as far as the composition of the task force, it really kind of depends on how far you're going to reach into the organization in terms of doing emergency backup planning. If you want to stick your toe in the water and just do the chief executive position, then I'd say, yourself as the CEO and the board chair maybe, and maybe another board member, and maybe if you've got an HR director, that person, or if you've got a chair of personnel committee, it doesn't have to be a huge, task force that, involves, a cast of thousands. Typically, we try to keep these groups down to about 5 and the key leadership. What we find is that keeping it to the key leadership and keeping it, relatively small, but having that both board and executive really allows you to have that frank discussion that, where, yes, ostensibly you're doing backup planning for the chief executive position, but it also is, gives you an opportunity really to talk about, for those of you that might be closer to retirement age, what are you doing to build bench depth in the organization? Do you have some possible successors in place? If not, can you do you have enough organizational size that you might be able to even, do that, in your next hire? So it gives you a chance to really kind of keep it small, keep the group small, but the conversation's large.
Good. Thank you. And the second step around the succession essentials has to do with what Don mentioned with the task force, providing an orientation to that task force to allow them to understand the project, their responsibilities, and sort of time frame for what the project looks like. So that's organizing the project and then making the assignments. Within the project, you may need key people based on their role within the organization to take on certain tasks. And so you have that conversation up front.
Lisa, forgive me for jumping in again. But
no, go right ahead.
One of the key things there, I think, is making sure that somebody's taking responsibility for what actually shows up on paper. Because one of the things, so in terms of, as you look down the rest of the 9 tasks, eventually you've got a couple documents that you really want to have the board, that the board's actually going to review. There are actually going to be some documents. So there's both soft product and hard product from this process. The hard product obviously is these 2 documents, and so you want somebody that's going to take responsibility for actually producing those. Now, you can follow the templates. The templates have a lot of the content already developed, and you'll see that there's questions that we ask along the way. These 9 steps are laid out in the guide that's available from the partnership. And within those steps, we've got questions that we pose to you. So, you don't have to start off with a blank sheet of paper. You can certainly do that, but, we've got the 2 templates there ready for you to take and edit. So having somebody to that's going to take on the responsibility for making sure that the paper gets organized for the board is going to be an important part of that process. And that really, allows the rest of the task force members really to focus on the decision making and the discussion. Back to you, Lisa.
Great. Thank you. The third step is to gather and update the supporting documents. So for the succession essentials, the work that you're doing probably requires that you have the position description, that you may want to look at any of the board policies around your chief executive. It may be included in your employee handbook. It may be in some of the, it may be in the bylaws. It may be in a variety of places, but gather any supporting documents that have to do with the role of your chief executive, and it may be about the contract of employment with that executive, anything that as you begin the conversation with this task force may be needed as a resource or a reference. Don, anything on that one?
No, just again, the job descriptions and maybe the organization chart, if you have one, would be a helpful document to have on hand.
Yeah. And the fourth step around gathering those documents is specifically the position description, and I know a number of you can attest to this. The job descriptions in some cases were created and then put on the shelf. So for doing this work, we ask that you make sure that the job descriptions are up to date. And that may take a little work. And as we look at these steps, we really want to look at, we're putting them in 9 steps, and so it seems all nice and neat with a bow tied around it. But understand that any of these steps could lead you to you know, some other sub-steps. So for those of you who have updated job descriptions, great. You've done this, check, you can move on to, you know, number 5. But for those of you that don't, you may want to step to the side, gather the information, look at your role, look at your calendar, look at your responsibilities, look at some of the tasks that you've been doing, and use that to update your job description. So that step of updating your job description could be easy or could be time-consuming depending on where the status of your current job description. And when we begin to talk about some of the other staff, the other leadership team, again, you may want to have that conversation with the team around the job descriptions. You may want to share the job descriptions before they're finalized. So there may be some work involved in step number 4, depending on how recently you've updated your job descriptions.
Lisa, one of the things that point I would make about updating the job descriptions, so the reason why you want to do that is you'll see when you look at the template, there's actually a place to carve out the key responsibilities, the responsibilities that are, you know, really required to maintain business as usual in the organization. What are those key responsibilities? And you know, then detailing those out and then assigning a backup to that. So of course you'd want to have that reflect current reality in the organization. And as Lisa pointed out, oftentimes when we're working with organizations, what we see is that these job descriptions were artifacts from days gone by and don't really reflect, you know, what's really going on, what really needs to happen, you know, what the CEO's job really is currently. So you really want to make sure that those job descriptions are refreshed and that they're up to date.
The 5th step is to develop the emergency backup succession plans, and there is a sample in the tool that you can look at, but to actually go through the process of developing that plan. And as I mentioned earlier, the idea of what resources do you need to pull together in order to do that, it will be very important. And again, it could be a small job or a big job depending on the status of your documents.
As Lisa pointed out earlier, the emergency backup plan is essentially it's an agreement between the person that's being backed up and the people that are people that are providing the backup. And so, you'll see when you get the guide, or for those of you that already reviewed the guide, there's questions that we pose to you to help you kind of flesh out that template that's in the appendix of the guide. But one of the things that we've found particularly useful in doing the backup plan is it kind of relates to the work around updating the job description, and that's doing a process we call unpacking the job. It's taking a look, yes, certainly you want to look at the job responsibilities, but you know, by and large, none of us really live our job responsibilities. I mean, nobody says, you know, let me go consult my job description and see if that's, you know, really in my domain or not. You know, you have an impression about the job description, and then you work. You know, life shows up, and so what you want to do is you want to kind of capture some of that real life, you know, on the ground texture. And so a couple different ways of doing that or within this process we call unpacking the job. Of course, we're consultants, we've got to put a name around everything, right? But, you know, what are some of the key areas? Well, certainly the job responsibilities, but that's pretty flat. But take a look at your calendar. Walk through your calendar and really, you know, week by week, what kind of meetings did you have? And what does the character of those meetings tell you about the job? And invariably, we see, you know, much deeper dimensions to the job than what we see, you know, in the job description. For example, we were working with one of your colleagues, another community action agency director, and you know, read his job description. It's like, yeah, it reads like pretty much like a standard job description. Then sat with him and did the unpacking the job exercise. And we were walking through the calendar, and it was like, oh my God, you really get the richness of the position, that really, the whole resource development component. This guy was a master at building, relationships, and was really out there mixing it up. This federal agency, that federal agency, and this district office, and that district office, and the state, and so on and so forth. And, you just don't get the richness of that dimension, just looking at job responsibility. So look at the calendar, and you'll see in the template there is a calendar component. Another dimension is relationships and key contacts. And who are those relationships that are really absolutely vital to your agency's future? And which of those relationships do only you as a CEO hold the keys to that relationship? You are really the interface between your organization and that organization through your relationship with this individual. Who are those? And, how can you get those cataloged and so forth? So, and to the extent possible, is there a way of kind of helping, taking, your emergency backup person along with you in the next meeting, so that at least there's some familiarity there that, hey, look, pay attention. This is an important relationship, to the organization. So it's not just about the job description or job responsibilities, but really getting into the calendar, the time dimension of it, getting into the relationships and the kind of the relational dimension of the organization, and relational dimension of the job is really vitally important as well. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you. There was a question about whether there are example emergency backup plans and succession policies we could see. In terms of the emergency backup plan, we do have the worksheets, so that and they are part of the tool, but the worksheet sort of shows you the kinds of questions that we ask in the emergency backup plan. And then the succession policy, we do have a draft of the template for the succession policy, and so that certainly is something that is shared in the toolkit. And then if there are any specific questions about that, we can certainly answer those for individuals who have additional questions around that.
Yeah, the template really is an example. It's really written in an example format, and we spent a lot of time really working on trying to massage this and shape it into something that could be used as a best practice example or a promising practice example. So it really is an example, and although it just has the places where you can slot in your organization's name and make adjustments to it.
Yes. The sixth step is develop the succession policy, and as Don just mentioned, what we provide in the toolkit is a sample, but what beginning this work allows you to have that conversation with the board around these areas. So, from something as basic as, what do we call our team? We refer to a team of senior staff people. Are they your leadership team? Are they the senior team? Do they have some kind of cute name to the team? Who is this group of people that we're talking about? Within the board, when you decide that you want a board committee to work on this. Do you want the executive committee of the board to work on the succession policy? Do you want to form a committee, a new committee to work on this? So there's some cultural things that have to be added to this template so that we're clear for your organization what this means. But the policy itself, you can start with this template that we provide, but it allows the board to say, here's what we believe and approve to happen when we deal with succession planning, and it allows them to have that conversation around internal or external candidate, for example. Some organizations say it is our culture, it is our belief that we are grooming the next leader out of the ranks of our staff. So that leader development piece that I talked about earlier, if the organization is saying we want to hire someone from within, this is where you would put that information. organization. The idea about it being a national search, or we want to look outside of the organization. Again, whatever the policy is at the organization, this is where you would put it. A lot of organizations, you certainly want to leave it broad enough so that it will apply. You don't want it to seem as if it's all set in stone, but you do want to make sure that the board has an opportunity to have this conversation so that when the time comes, there's not confusion around the message and what the next steps should be around this. It's just a matter of implementing the policy that the board has discussed. But you can certainly use this time to have that discussion with the board. And so they start with this task force starts with the initial template. They customize it for your organization. A number of conversations need to happen around internal or external, or the use of an interim executive director. Any of those kind of conversations, the board can have these conversations, finalize it, and then put it into the succession policy.
Lisa, I might point out that oftentimes the succession policy is a place where you really get present to the values of the organization and values around how you hold, staff development, so forth. For example, there are some organizations that, really wouldn't even consider hiring somebody from the outside. I had a client in California where they've had this is a 44-year-old organization, and they just hired fairly recently their fourth executive director, and every one of them has been, of course, the founder was not, but every one of the successors has been someone inside the organization. Most of the time, though, what we find is that most organizations, where they come down on this, they want to, certainly want to consider all the internal internal candidates, but we also, for due diligence, we want to do a broader search. That's where most organizations come down on this. Another thing I might point out with respect to the succession policy, this is another reason why you might want to have a couple board members on your task force and not have it just be an all staff-driven thing. I certainly have seen executives from our workshops where they've simply taken the templates, plugged in the name of the organization, presented it to the board, and that was the end of it. You can certainly do that, but that really is focused on the hard product. You don't get the value of the soft product, and having a couple board members involved really helps in terms of presenting the succession policy to the board. There's something about a board member hearing from one of their peers that's been enmeshed in this, that really has engaged with it, that brings a different quality to it. So just a little plug for having board members on that task force.
Good idea. Thanks. So now that you've organized your task force, you've given them a proper orientation, you've gathered your documents, you've updated your job description, you've completed your backup succession plans, you have your succession policy, it's time to review all of this information with the committee and reflect on, your end product, making sure that it includes those values of the organization that Don just mentioned, to make sure that the end product takes in mind all of those things that, you talked about and that are important to the organization. And then once your task force has had a chance to talk about all of this, it's then time for step number 8 to review and reflect with the board. So remember, this task force is a small group of people. Now it's time to get it to the folks that govern the organization. It's time for them to see this information and to have it presented to them in a way that allows them to see that there has been work done, and to give them their ultimate authority of approving this policy and moving it along. And typically you would see the succession policy is what they are approving, and then the emergency backup plan for the CEO is usually attached to that. Now, I say for the CEO specifically because the board is the person that is responsible for the CEO. It would not include, in most cases, it would not include the backup plans for the rest of the leadership team, because the rest of the leadership team works for the executive director, so the board doesn't need to approve that. It is important that the board know that this was done, but in terms of the board's work and what you're asking them to do at this review and reflection stage is to look at the succession policy, which needs to be adopted by the board, and the emergency backup plan of the CEO only.
Lisa, if I might chime in on a couple things about the review and reflection, is that this is the richness of this is an opportunity really for the richness of the work to show up. You know, this is a place where you can really begin to open up those questions about bench depth in the organization. What is this telling you? Particularly if you've done backup plans for your broader executive team. Invariably, we find that even long-term executives who think that they're on top of absolutely everything are surprised when their executive team really digs into this and starts, you know, developing backup plans and reviewing them with the chief executive. You know, one organization I was working with, really top-notch CEO and fairly large organization. I think they had about 215 employees, and I forget exactly the size of the budget. It's really irrelevant. They had multiple divisions, and we were working with putting succession plans in place for all of their division directors in addition to the CEO. And we got to this when we were reviewing these succession plans with their emergency backup plans with the chief executive, and we got to this one, and he just sort of went, huh, that's really interesting. And so, like, what's that about? And, you know, this person, the director of one of these divisions, hadn't designated her deputy as her backup. She had actually leaped over this person and gone to somebody else in the organization. Well, you know, he hadn't realized that there was that much tension between the division director and that deputy, and she wasn't about to, you know, designate this person as their backup, you know. So, you know, there's little discoveries that can be made along the way, so you get the richness of it. The other thing I would suggest, and this is somewhat controversial among our team members, I'm of the belief that the whole reason for doing this is organizational sustainability. This is really about, you know, the only reason to put all this, you know, go through all this trouble and so forth is really to sustain, you know, the mission work of the organization. And this is a great time for the organization to take a look at what is oftentimes a key unfunded liability in the organization. And chief executives that are on the call, you're going to love this, and that is looking at the CEO salary and looking at whether or not it reflects market rate. Again, this is controversial, but, you know, what we find often, you know, in our search practice, we've been doing, you know, chief executive transitions for 20 years, and we've seen the good and the bad and the ugly of that. And what we see oftentimes, you know, particularly when there's been a founder or a long-term executive in place, we see oftentimes that the CEO, departing CEO, is maybe 10%, 20%, 30%. Their salary is 10, 20, or 30% under market. And so then the organization is confronted with, first of all, you know, hiring a new executive in, probably at that higher salary, and then, you know, how do they fund that? You know, they've got to come up with, you know, $20,000, $30,000 in the budget, and, you know, things being tight, how do we do that? But yet we've got to make an attractive offer to somebody. And also the board is kind of confronted with this embarrassment of, geez, you know, we're really going to bring in the new person at $30,000 above. What is that? You know, how do we face that, you know, with the current executive? So, you know, I'm not saying that you need to, you know, be at the tip-top end of the market, but, you know, I think this is a great place. You know, if you're really taking this on all about organizational sustainability, this would be a great place to take a look at salaries not just CEO salaries, but across the board, and ask yourselves, are you really being a competitive employer?
Thank you. The last step to this process is to finalize, implement, and put it on the calendar for review. And so here, you've talked about the work of this task force. You've talked about these policies that at this point are in draft form. You have your board meeting, and now the board approves it, and it is final. In some cases, the board approves it, has some amendments, has something, they want to add or take out of the discussion or the policy as it was written. And so you use this time to do that. But ultimately, you finalize the plan and then begin to implement those items that are mentioned in the plan. But the key thing here is to put it on the calendar for review. We talked about backups and the people who are backing up some of the key functions. Well, that changes, can change, during the year. So you want to make sure that you have the opportunity to review who is backing you up, making sure that person is still there, making sure that backup still makes sense, making sure that the cross-training that you mentioned that needs to happen has occurred or has been scheduled to occur. So this piece of the implementation of the plan is very important. And again, you don't want to do all of this work and have it forgotten. So you want to make sure it gets finalized, that the board actually adopts this this policy, and that the plans are completed, the staff all understand who they're backing up, who their backup is, and it is all, finalized for when you need it. Anything else on that, Don?
I think you covered it. So that's as Lisa talked about, the 9 steps. Those 9 steps are the framework for the toolkit. And so now we're ready to open it up to questions. Cashin, I think there was a question about where the documents are.
Yes, we've had a couple of questions that have come in about both the fact that the PDF of the slides will be available as well as a link to the recording, and that the toolkits, the guides, are already up. They are on the resource bank of the CSBG TNTA Resource Center. That's at csbgtta.org. And they are also on the partnerships website if you go over to either National Training Center or Resources. All 3 parts of this guide are already posted and ready for you to review and bring your questions.
Great. Other questions, please chime in. We have some resources also that we wanted to share with you, and I'll turn it over to you, Don.
Okay. I mentioned earlier Next Steps, which is a 2-day intensive workshop for particularly useful for founders and long-term executives, but founder-like executives, people that have been really transformational. And for those that are thinking about leaving in the next, say, 1 to 5 years, or you may not have a specific date in mind, but it's going to happen within the next couple of years. Next Steps is a 2-day program that's focused on taking some of these topics that we discussed in the toolkit webinars and really taking them to a much deeper level. It's 2 days. The first day is focused on deep dive into the tools and doing a organizational sustainability assessment. And the second day we look at, we have a couple breakout sessions where you can take a deeper dive into the tools and work on a plan for your organization, whether that be a succession plan, a sustainability plan, or an executive transition plan. And then the second day we focus also on a panel discussion that discusses, it's a panel of people that have been through transitions, board members and executives that have been through transitions, so you have an opportunity really to talk with them about their experience, their lessons learned, what they would do differently, what they would do the same, so forth. And then finally, there's prior to a really deep dive planning session, then there's we do some exploration of the whole topic of communication from the earliest inklings that you have that you think you might want to retire or leave your position, to how do you introduce that to the board, in what fashion, and then take you right on through the announcement process to the staff and stakeholders and so forth. So 2 days, and it's all done in a very confidential space. The workshop is limited to 30 people. Typically, we have somewhere between 15 to 28 executives. The December one is at NeighborWorks Training Institute, so it's open to chief executives and board leaders as well as senior staff. So it's going to be a little bit more of a mixed audience because that's the way the NeighborWorks Training Institute works. The one in January at the Meyer Foundation is exclusively for chief executives. And a couple other resources that we have. There's a newsletter that you can sign up for if you go onto the Transition Guides website. Comes out about 5 times a year, and it's focused on chief executive transitions and succession. Lots of good stories, lots of good examples. We really try to elevate examples of people that are doing it right in terms of those areas, in terms of preparing the organization and sustainability. There's also on our website, there's a series of monographs that we developed for the Annie Casey Foundation around succession planning and next generation leaders, as well as some other topics, including leader development planning. And then finally, a couple books that we've authored. There's one available from BoardSource. It really is the board's guide to chief executive transitions. It's Chief Executive Transitions, How to Hire and Support a Nonprofit CEO. And then my colleague Tom Adams wrote the Nonprofit Leadership Guide. It's available from Amazon.com. Any other questions?
I haven't seen any that have come in, though of course you are encouraged to put those into the Q&A box. We'll take those as they come. We did, in fact, provide an extra 15 minutes to this webinar to make sure that we had plenty of time to get all questions and feedback in. Everything that we've seen has been about where can I find the guide, where can I find the slides, things like that, and those are all posted on the Partnerships website and on the Resource Center. So while we take those last questions that are hopefully coming in, are there closing words on your side?
I just want to make a pitch for Wednesday's webinar. We've, in the series, we started off kind of with the question of how do you create a more sustainable organization and a 4-part framework for that. Today, we've kind of taken it down a little bit more particular to how do you sustain leaders in organizations and how do you ensure that that continuity through different types of succession planning. And then Wednesday, we're going to take it down to the very particular of how do you manage a chief executive transition in particular, or another senior management position. The tools that we're going to be presenting are applicable more broadly in the organization, although we tend to focus on the chief executive because of the risk involved in trying to help community action agencies drive out some of that risk, particularly as you have founders and long-term executives leaving these CEO positions. And so we're going to be covering a 3-part framework there of how to prepare successfully and how to really prepare in a way that helps drive out some of the risk, how to manage the search and the parallel transition process, how to interview, so forth, and then we'll cap it off with some discussion about the post-hire. And what we find is oftentimes boards, and this would be a great place for those of you that are that know that you're going to be facing an executive transition. This would be a great webinar to have your board members join you because it really, the board has to lead that process. This is a place where they can't really lean on you any longer, and so they really need to step up and take on that process. And so this really ought to be, this webinar on Wednesday really ought to be the board's webinar. So I encourage you, for those of you that are confronting the transition, try and get your board members there. For those of you that want to learn something about a process that's very successful in terms of the stick rate of executives that that are placed through this process, it'll be a great tool for you as well.
All right, thank you. Well, I have not seen other questions that have come in. I know it does take some time sometimes to let those kind of the material sink in a little bit, and then it occurs to you at 3 o'clock in the morning or when you're taking a shower tomorrow or something like that. So if you do have continuing questions, you are welcome to email them to me at cyiu@communityactionpartnership.com, and we will get those forwarded onto Transition Guides to get you an answer. You can also put them on the forum of the Resource Center, and we will answer them that way as well. With that, I think we are getting ready to sign off for the day. There will be an evaluation that pops up at the end. We do appreciate your feedback on this. This will let you tell us what you thought about this webinar and to give us ideas for what you want to see in the future. So thank you again to both Dawn and Lisa for being on here today. Is there anything else that you would like to impart us with?
I'd just like to say thanks to all of you out there listening to this for what you do in the world and the difference that you make in the lives of people. Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right. Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.